Admiral,
Mr. Scott.
those departure orders, 12 hours. Starfleet cannot be serious.
Why aren't the Enterprise transporters operating, Mr. Scott?
Oh, wee problem, sir. Just temporary. Admiral, we have just finished 18 months redesigning and refitting the Enterprise. How in the name of hell do they expect me to have her ready in 12 hours?
Take me over, please.
She needs more work, sir. A shakedown.
Mr. Scott. An alien object of unbelievable destructive power is less than 3 days away from this planet. The only starship in interception range is the Enterprise. Ready or not, she launches in 12 hours.
The crew haven't had near enough transition time with all the new equipment. And the engines are not even tested at warp power. And an untried captain.
2.5 years as Chief of Starfleet Operations may have made me a little stale, but I wouldn't exactly consider myself untried. They gave her back to me, Scotty.
Gave her back, sir? I doubt it was that easy with Nagura.
You're right.
Well, any man who could manage such a feat, I would not dare disappoint. She'll launch on time, sir, and she'll be ready.
Hi, everybody, and welcome once again to GeekFest Rants. My name is Carlos Perron, and joining me, I have James. Say hi, James.
Hello, hello.
Well, today we are going to do something that we kind of did a very long time ago, and that is we're going to focus on a specific aspect of a franchise. And by that, I mean, last time we did the Millennium Falcon, like years ago, I think it was. We did a couple of shows about it. And today we're focusing on another franchise, Star Trek this time, where you have a ship that is so iconic that it is almost another character of, the franchise itself. It's just as important, in my opinion, as the Falcon is to Star Wars, the Enterprise is to Star Trek. Now, we're going to try to cover as much of the history of the ship as possible, even the history that the ship is based on. By that, I mean the real history. On some of the episodes I remember of watching, especially Next Generation, you got to see this wall, this display of all the different Enterprises in the past. And even in the motion picture, which is, one of the first times we actually got to see this in a movie theater, there's a scene where you see a couple of pictures of the previous Enterprises. So, James, why don't we start with what, according to the canon, let's say, of the show, the Enterprise is based on, the actual real things and fake things that this a particular vessel is based on.
Well, this being the 50th anniversary of Star Trek is a big year, and the Enterprise goes much, much farther back than 50 years. And
oh, yeah.
I would say we would start, many ships have been named Enterprise and some very good ships. I would say, for our purposes, one of the first ones, and there were a number of vessels with this name in the British Navy, but I would say the British sailing ship is where Star Trek and where we kind of can pick up as being one of the first big, powerful enterprises. And it is also seen on a number of those charts, like you said, in the motion picture they show it, and in a couple of other places. And that started a tradition of other ships. Like I said, many ships have been named Enterprise in the British fleet, and also in the American fleet. Most recently is a nuclear carrier named Enterprise, and that's recently been decommissioned. And you've seen that in Star Trek The Voyage Home, which actually wasn't the Enterprise. It was another ship that was available in dock, but it was very similar. And the American Navy is very proud of that name, and there'll be a new ship within the next 10 to 20 years commissioned called Enterprise. Just like in the Star Trek lore, the ship goes forward in a new generation of style of ship. So beyond that, then, I would say the most famous one to probably most people our age is the Space Shuttle Enterprise. Now, that was originally going to be named something else, but because of fan outcry and mail campaign, which Star Trek fans are known for, and various other forms of getting people's attention, NASA was petitioned to name it Enterprise after the Star Trek ship, and there was a commissioning ceremony where almost all of the Star Trek cast.
Oh,
and
yeah,
Gene
they were there,
Roddenberry
yeah.
appeared in 1976 to christen, if you will, or to, have a little bit of a ceremony for the new Enterprise. And although it's not a starship, that space shuttle never flew in space, ironically. It was only used for gliding tests and landing tests and some various other aerodynamic experiments. It was still an important part of the space shuttle team of ships, and unfortunately, they were never. It was built too heavy. After Challenger first and then Columbia were destroyed, it was said, "Hey, why don't we try to use this as an orbiter?" And it was, it was explained it just wasn't built that way. It was much heavier. It was never built to the same specs as the ones that we know that went into space. It was always just a test ship.
Right. Now, from there, we jump to now the fictional, historical Star Trek progression of the Enterprises with a completely different shape of ship.
Yeah, well, let me tell you about this one. This one is seen in the motion picture pretty prominently when Decker and Ilea are touring the ship, trying to get her memory back when she becomes the probe. And you see a ringed ship. And it's in the background, and we didn't have HD. And even in a motion picture, it was in the background. You see it, you can make it out, you could explain what it looked like, but you didn't see a lot of detail back then. And since then, it's been considered almost official as an early Federation, maybe pre-warp ship or something like that, and it's called the Ring Ship, and it looks like something maybe out of 2001, A Space Odyssey or something like that. It's rings towards the back where the engines would be, and it's a long, narrow neck with a bridge area or a crew area up front. And I learned more about this ship through something back from 1979, which may or may not still be available, but it's called the Star Trek Spaceflight Chronology, and it was essentially a telling of the history of Star Trek and spaceflight into the motion picture era. And I love that book. I read it. I still have it. Obviously, it's make-believe, but I really studied it as if it was a real document, a real history. And it was ultimately updated in something put out by the Okudas, who were very prominent in The Next Generation and all the Star Treks after that. And they put out a book which was essentially the history of Starfleet, I guess, and it would go back to anything that appeared in the show, back to like when they mentioned on one of the Next Generation episodes the primordial ooze that Picard's people came from Q explaining it, blah, blah, blah. So it starts way back then and works its way into anything that was talked about into the future, the deep future or the alternate futures, and it's been updated a number of times, and that ship again was mentioned there in addition to all the other future Enterprises. So I really like, even though those, like I said, are make-believe, they're fictional accounts of the future, I love reading that because it fills in some gaps by people who are part of the production of Star Trek in things that happened off screen and things that happened even with characters that we know and we saw on screen, but like little pieces that were only mentioned briefly, and they fleshed them out a little bit. So I love those books.
Now, from what I understand, the actual design of that particular ship, that ring ship you're talking about, I believe it was going to be used originally when Star Trek was going to be another television series again. And then at the last minute, they pulled the plug and said, no, let's turn it into a movie because Star Wars just came out and we need to make a movie out of it instead. So they kept that conceptual design and they kind of worked it into the movie.
Exactly. It was like a concept, like we've talked about all the concepts that Macquarie and a bunch of other people have drawn for Star Wars and various other movies and shows. It was one of the potential concepts. It could have been a future Enterprise, a new Enterprise, something, like we're saying, alternate things. And they were at least very cool to keep it in the world of Star Trek and not just throw it in a scrap heap. And that's happened in a couple of other ones that we eventually see.
Now, what's funny also is that because at the time of the motion picture, you didn't have as much history as you do now with the show and the canon of the show. In the motion picture, you jump from the ring ship to the Kirk traditional Enterprise, but now because years have passed and more canon has been added to it, in terms of time, the next ship is the one from the show Enterprise, which is the NX1 Enterprise.
I remember when this was unveiled, and I remember it very prominently. There was an unveiling, I think either TV Guide or Entertainment Weekly or somebody at the time had the first picture of it. And I said, it's interesting. But to me, even now, it's too cool. It's still, the show wasn't as popular. It was well received, but it wasn't as popular as all the other Star Trek shows, unfortunately. But in the world of Star Trek, it was too cool looking and too modern in a lot of ways compared to the Enterprise that we know from the original series.
It looked very aerodynamic, which the regular Enterprise did not. So it was like, it was out of place almost.
Yeah, I think that as cool as it was, and they've even done a retcon on that as if it's been refitted for books and for some of the other things that have come out since the show went off the air. They added an engineering section and things that made it more Star Trek-ish. And I would say it's pretty darn cool. There's no problem with it. On the show, it was well represented. It did a lot of cool things. They tried to make it like it didn't have, I don't think it had transporters yet or anything like that.
Well, it was the beginning of transporter technology, I think. So I think they used them very sparingly because they were still experimental, I believe.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure. It wasn't a 1701 yet. It was, I'm not even sure if it was fully warp capable when it started.
It was like I said, it was the NX1. And it also didn't have full-blown shields. It had this thing about, I think they called it ionizing the plating or something, and it wasn't...
They still had armor that was somehow electrified. Yes, like you said, ionized.
They even had a harpoon to capture other ships. They would grab other ships with a grappling hook or something, which is instead of tractor beams.
Yeah, so that was a pretty neat design. It still holds up today, and when they do novels or they do these little things, it's cool to see, and that they've added some parts to it to make it a little more...
It also kind of looked a little bit like a submarine inside. It had a lot of hatches that they had to jump over to get through things, and it was a little more confined. It felt more confined than the future ships.
Yeah, on the show, it was only built maybe 130 years, 135 years past where we are right now. So it would still, you would say it would still have things that were more earthbound, or even though it was going into space. Now, of course, a show like Star Trek, you have to suspend disbelief and say, yeah, it's out there and it's real and it's it does all these things. But in the past 100 years, we've only just gotten into space. So it makes sense that it wouldn't have all the things that the Starship Enterprise from the original series has, which turns out to be an awesome ship and a great design. And it's really held up all these years later that once you see that, no matter who you are, I don't think there's many people who could say, what is that? They know it's from Star Trek at the very least. Almost everyone, even non-fans.
Yeah, that's the one that most people, I would imagine, would recognize off the bat as the traditional image of what a Star Trek television show ship looks like. Now, the thing we have to also keep in mind for people who are discovering Star Trek now or watching it now for the first time is that in a lot of instances now, if you're watching Star Trek that is being repeated in a channel, whether it's a sci-fi channel or something of that, or BBC or Netflix, what's out there now is a more modern, souped-up version of Star Trek, which they went in and they replaced a lot of the original special effects with CGI renderings of all these special effect shots, including the majority of the ships. So you have to be careful what you're looking at. If you really want to see the original design and the original effects, you're going to have to dig a little deeper because most of the stuff that's out there, I believe, is the newer stuff. Now, don't get me wrong. It looks fantastic. The ships do these things that they couldn't do before, and the effects are so much cleaner. There's less grain, but you're not getting the original, effect that you might want to look for.
In fact, the very original Enterprise had a slightly different bridge look and had some other features that were slightly different from what's in the actual series. The Shatner series, the stuff that came from the pilot with Jeffrey Hunter, Christopher Pike, that looked slightly different. Then you have the Kirk ones, which have slight changes, but that model still exists and has just been redone and will be seen again at the Smithsonian. The one at Dulles, the Air and Space Museum Annex in Dulles, they will relaunch it this year for fans to see. And then even, like you said, in the HD versions that they did, they cleaned that up even more and added some features that never existed on the original model.
Right, they fixed up the lights, the effects, and all that stuff. Yeah,
that's
the lasers.
all okay because it made it it took a show that's now 50 years old and it made it more palatable for younger audiences who didn't really like the old ways and the matte. You could see the matte lines sometimes. It was
Yeah.
they did a step past cleaning out the matte lines by adding new effects. And I've watched all of the old ones, obviously, and I've watched all of the new ones with the HD effects very recently. In fact, I redid it getting ready for some of the anniversary years and shows we might be doing. They really look good. They did very well trying to make things fit and the movements. And one of the other things in that era, when they started doing these HD looks, in the show Enterprise, they went back and added one of the ships that were basically a Constitution class in a sequel type of way to one of the Star Trek episodes, even though this is a prequel show, it was a sequel episode, so on and so forth, when the ship is in a alternate timeline, basically, and we get to see, what a Constitution class can really do on screen from that era. And that was really neat to see.
Yeah. Now, again, when we're dealing with the classic Shatner one, that's the NCC 1701, the classic ship,
Yes.
which, as far as features goes, it's got a basic version of everything that's futuristic about the show. You have your lasers, your torpedoes, you have your tractor beam, you can beam down to planets, you have force fields, you have shuttles that can depart and enter the ship in itself. And this is something that will carry on through the majority of all the future versions of the Enterprise.
I would say once we get to the motion picture, and I can remember seeing the commercial for, and some of the Starlog stuff, and not really going deep into what was going on when it was first unveiled. And I'm like, oh my gosh, they've got a new Enterprise. And then you get to know more as you get to read that it's the same Enterprise. They've finished their mission. They've come back.
Mm-hmm.
They've done a complete redesign, refit, which actually happens to ships, and not so much that it has such brazen differences, but they'll take a ship, and if the hull and the structure are still usable, and they will add new weapons, they will add new decks, if it's a carrier, new landing equipment, new and launching equipment, things like that, new bridge. And this ship, they were very bold because what they needed to do was freshen up the ship for the movies and make it more exciting and more, we're talking, I guess when the movie came out, it was 10 years since it was off the air already. And, they wanted to make it more exciting for the motion picture era. And I love it. To me, that is the ship of all the ships. Everybody loves the Millennium Falcon. Yes, I do. Everybody loves X-Wings. Yes, I do. All the other Enterprises, some of them are very exciting to look at. I love the Enterprise that was in the motion picture. And the scene of the shuttle and Kirk and Scotty going around it with the fantastic music, there's just no better way to unveil that ship. And when you watch it still, even on TV, seeing it in the movie for the first time, non-HD, exciting movie theater, it blew my mind. And I'm like, this is Star Trek. This is great. And I still hold that scene and that film very close to me because I love looking at that ship.
Now, this being a refit, as you mentioned before, even though they change a lot of parts and, the outer shell of the ship, let's say, for example, it does look more aerodynamic to me, more slick. It just looks modern. They take away all those right angles that you had with the traditional ship, and they make them more slightly curvier so that you can get the feel that this is a more modern, futuristic version of what they had before.
Yes, I think that, like I said, is the best. And I guess if you want to say it's the same ship, yes, and it's a new ship. So most of the time I find that you can't buy one without the other. It's not like you could just say, oh, well, I'll pick one. If they put it out and you're a collector of ships, you're buying both of them, the TV version and the motion picture version.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that same ship is essentially what's in Star Trek, The Wrath of Khan, and ultimately being destroyed in Star Trek, The Search for Spock. And that was a sad scene. I guess they had to do it. And like the character said, like McCoy says, you did what you had to do, what you always do, stuff like that, to destroying the ship. And that started an era of let's destroy the Enterprise every few movies type of thing. And it's continuing to this day, and I don't know how I feel about it. I feel like it's becoming more of a gimmick, and I'm exaggerating a little bit. Every few movies they destroy it. It just feels that way.
Well, how do we go from the refit to the A?
Exactly. So at the very least, we get another ship. And There was at the time, most people don't remember, there was a time because in Star Trek 3, you see the unveiling of the Excelsior style ship.
Exactly.
That look. And everybody was assuming that's the next version of the ship. And it probably should have been. In the DC Comics, there's a period of time after the Enterprise is destroyed that Kirk actually gets control and captaincy of the Excelsior until ultimately there's what happens at the end of Star Trek 4, and that's an Enterprise A. And they decided, I guess, to go back to the tried and true model, probably, I'm guessing, because of budget. And they said, look, if we change this ship, now we have to change all of our stock footage and our models and things like that. However, in the world of Star Trek, that was basically it's alleged that it's either the Yorktown recommissioned as the Enterprise A to celebrate Kirk's success and as like a bit of a reward for him. And if you read Wikipedia or some of these other fan books or fan magazines, it's rumored that it could be other ships that hadn't yet been commissioned or something. I'm going with the Yorktown because I read that in Starlog or I read that in some other publication back in the day. So there was no time for it to be retconned yet to be something cooler. So we have the Enterprise A for the remainder of essentially the original series movies. We see it in Star Trek V. We see it in the Undiscovered Country as well.
Undiscovered Country, Final Frontiers there before. Yeah.
Never discussed exactly what happens to it afterwards. Undiscovered Country ends, and the next time we see Kirk and Chekhov and Scotty, they're on what's called the Enterprise B. And so, again,
in
online,
Generations.
Yeah, in Generations. Online, there's some discussion that, what happens, that the ship was put in a museum, the ship was eventually destroyed in one of the Shatner novels, the ship did this, it did that. I don't know what we can believe. Nobody's really picked a pure canon like they have now recently with the Star Wars series, and somebody is actually in charge of making sure things make sense. Sometimes when shows get this old, 50 years is a long time. Doctor Who's gone through this. A couple of other shows have gone through it. You can't have an answer for every little detail because it takes away from a writer's ability to write future stories that might be fun and exciting. So you can believe what you want or believe on the internet. To me, it's out there someplace. I'm sure something happened to it. I don't need to know it at the moment. But we have an Enterprise B, and at the point of Generations, we're first introduced to it, and it's a pretty cool ship. They essentially took the Excelsior and modernized it, made it cooler, gave it some cool teal lighting, and they gave us Cameron as the captain from...
Right, Kirk is no longer... he's no longer in charge. He's there to kind of see the ship being sent off, on its
it's a ceremonial
voyage.
Launching or it's ceremonially handing off, but by Cameron, it's Alan Ruck, the actor who played Cameron in Ferris Bueller. And it's a pretty cool looking ship, and I'm actually disappointed that's all we saw of it. I think... I think they wrote a lot of novels about it, and there were some comics involving it. But on screen, that's the last we saw of it, sadly. I like it, and I have to tell you, it's recently gotten its due. They've released it as an Eagle Moss ship in the past year or two, which are those metallic ones that come out with a magazine every month. And they've also released it as an Art Asylum ship, which is the ones with sounds and lights
those big
and stuff
ones,
like that. And that came out within the past couple years. And of course, I bought it the day it came out. And I'm telling you, it's still cool to look at 20 years later. And I don't know if they're ever going to make a Hallmark ornament. I mean, you and I in particular have purchased probably every version of the ships that they've made. They've made Hallmark ornaments in every one we've bought. They've made Galoob made those micro machines, and we bought those sets of all of them and displayed them.
And the Japanese ones too?
Yes, I remember buying you some of those Japanese ones, and then I think you bought some on your own because we couldn't wait for Hallmark to finish the line, and they were almost in the same scale, so we could at least put them on our tree to match it up. The Art Asylum ones, the Eagle Moss ones I've bought and displayed. So I'm a bit of a weirdo, perhaps, but I love these ships so much, and they feel like they're part of not just the show, but they're like part of real history. So again, when you buy one, you can't not buy another one. So I have groups of 6 or 7 ships in all these different scales all over the house and all over my vault.
Oh, yeah. Now, by the time we get to the Enterprise C, we're dealing in history of Next Generation. So
that's right.
The path to C, it's kind of like we first get to D and then we learn about C.
Well, the funny thing is about that, like you say, we go from basically A to D. And that gave the writers some time to say, look, we're in the future. This is in the future. So it gave writers a chance to say, well, what came before that? What did they look like? But if you look at the early episodes of Next Generation and then the movies, there was a wall, a lot like in Star Trek the Motion Picture, that showed the historical progression of the ship. And it shows what looks like these bronze. It depends on how the lighting is. They're either bronze or silver versions of the B and the C, and everybody went nuts extrapolating, okay, so what is this? So the B was basically an Excelsior,
right?
Which is what we talked about, how everybody figured that would be the next step. But it was the Excelsior like we saw it in Star Trek 3 with the rounded engineering section, not with that extra bit that eventually we got. And the C was a squatter, fatter engineering section, shorter bridge of the D. So when you got to see that on TV, you'd get these quick glances because, again, we weren't talking the HD TV era. We're talking us getting in 420 if you had that good of a TV. You know, there were still people who had black and white, or, you know, we were watching on antennas on Channel 11 or something, so you could barely tell what you were seeing, but people would draw them. People would make their own homemade models and stuff like that, until we ultimately got to see an episode that showed the C in action. And it was an awesome episode. It was a fantastic episode to feature that ship, and unfortunately, that's all we got of it. And I think you eventually see it later on in other episodes of The Next Generation with other names. You see it with other names.
Yeah, and the history they give us about that particular Enterprise is that it is historical, not only because it's an Enterprise, but it
defended Klingons.
It defended the Klingons against the Romulans and died. And they basically sacrificed their crew to defend Klingons, in effect, causing the peace accords to happen, you know, between the Federation and the Klingons.
At the time in the history of The Next Generation, it was a pretty big deal for various, and in addition to for the Deep Space Nine era of shows, you know, it all had these underlying, overarching historical significance to all these different characters, how everybody kind of got together in a roundabout way.
Now, this brings us to another gigantically classic one because it happened while we got to see it live because we were of that age, and that is the Enterprise D, the Next Generation Enterprise, which, keep in mind also, as these ships progress in size, they get bigger and bigger and bigger. So this guy is like a luxury liner almost in terms of how big it is. And one of the biggest advancements that they show us is the fact that the saucer can separate from the body in case of emergencies, for example, and the body goes in one direction and the saucer can do something else in another direction.
Yeah, supposedly that was a capability available to as far back as the original series in the Bible, let's say, in the writer's Bible, allegedly. They just could never find a way to do it because of expense, because of special effects abilities, because of just, why would we do this? It didn't make sense because once we do it, is it coming back? You know, they were at least smart enough in the Next Generation era to realize, we can separate it. And when everything's cool, bring it on back if everybody's...
Right, but ironically, after so many seasons, they only used it a handful of times.
Yeah, it was a gimmick. It was based... I remember in the very first episode, they talked about, how the bridge, and we're going to be able to see...
that was going to be a big feature.
They're like, okay, everybody to the battle bridge, and it turns into this big thing, and part of the crew goes this way, and they lock the hatches, and they go, and they separate, and they made a big deal of showing, and like the dust separating from the locks, and things like that. And I'm thinking at the time, I remember watching it in 1987 when the September 87 when the show launched, and I'm saying, this is just a gimmick. They don't need to do this. This is just so they can kill 5 minutes and show us doing a cool thing because it's a 2-hour premiere episode type of thing. And it did it, like you said, and the saucer goes over one direction and winds up looking like a saucer from V, one of the alien visitor saucers. And and the engineering section goes into another direction, which almost looks like a cobra head with this stuff attached to it. And I'm like, all right, it can do that. I don't think I said to myself at the time, I don't think they're going to do this a lot because it's going to get a little ridiculous. And then they did it a couple times until they eventually did it in Generations, and it became the ultimate gimmick because that was the end of the Enterprise D.
Yeah, that's much later, and they actually, like you said, they finally used it again. I guess they must have had too much fan pressure saying, hey, whatever happened to that? But another cool thing about this ship, and again, which made it more modern and made it different than the previous ones, is that now you had a holodeck, a room where you can kind of recreate just about any environment in a fake manner, but it looks very real.
And we've talked about this, and this was probably stolen from Yamato, which became Star Blazers. And I guarantee you that unofficially Roddenberry or somebody suggested this, because there is a holodeck type of thing on Yamato, and there is also a character named Geordi. And it just seems a little like, hey, this is a Japanese animation. Maybe nobody's seen it, and we can bring it into our thing, and we'll call it, And then there's other rumors that Geordi was named after a guy named George LaForge or something like that, a big super fan who is, blah, blah, blah. So who knows if that, but yeah, that existed on that ship.
The other thing I remember they were promoting also is the fact that the ship would feature a bar where the characters would hang out and talk, a place for, I guess, for story development to take place.
Not quite a Star Wars cantina, but a place where they can loosen up, and it gave Whoopi an opportunity to become part of the cast, which actually was one of the best additions to any Star Trek show.
Yeah. And like James said, they stuck with this particular design of the ship and the same model ship, basically, all through the episodes. In theory, this ship is still existing while DS9 is taking place and Voyager is taking place.
And they showed this style in other names. Like they called it the Yamato, and they called it the Galaxy, and they called it a couple other ones.
The other thing also to remember is that there have been episodes of the show where we've seen like alternate timelines. And I remember one, and I think it was called Yesterday's Enterprise, where you see a ship that looks very much like the Sea, because it was more of a militaristic type of ship. So those, I don't know if we want to really get into, because they're alternates.
Well, I don't know if that was the right episode, but the alternate version of the D is a refit, supposedly, of the D for that final episode, All Good Things, as if it had a third nacelle and it had more guns and it had more armaments on it and things like that. So that's all cool things they did. And the fact that they even designed the D the way they did was because, as you recall, some of the things that they couldn't quite do, Roddenberry still had a little bit of control back then, and he wanted families on board, and he wanted it to have a huge saucer section, so it was more, more friendly. If you're going on a long mission to bring your family, you might have kids with you, things like that, rather than it being just a pure warship, which more of the original series ships were. So it's a two-way street. It's a little weird to have kids on a ship that may go into heavy battle, which it did. And if you recall, they even had guys wearing skirts in the early episodes, as if this is a very progressive era in the future. And I just think that was a good idea, but they kind of downplayed that as the years went on. There were children on board, but they didn't make a big deal about it, because the minute the Borg attacked, everybody would have to say, oh my God, but what about the children? And it's like, well, how do you fight an enemy if you're also protecting the children? It doesn't work both ways. I think that was something that was nice, a nice idea, but it became a bit of a hindrance probably as the years went on. And then it ultimately disappeared once we got into the Next Generation movie era.
Right. And then once again, we hit that reset button where you mentioned earlier, hey, we need a new ship, everybody. So they have to destroy, once again, the new classic Enterprise D by, like you said earlier, there's another saucer separation, and they crash the saucer, I think, or they crash the whole thing.
The other thing blows up. The engineering section blows up. The saucer section, basically, I think ultimately Troy was in charge of... Yeah,
she crashed the ship. She was acting captain.
She was at the helm and or something, and eventually, she crashed it on, I guess, Viridian or Viridian 3 or whatever they called it, and that was the end of the Enterprise D. And it was kind of cool to see, but not really. It ultimately looked like a big... I don't even know, like a big sausage flying through the woods, knocking over trees until it stopped, and they show this view of...
I don't know what kind of woods you've been hanging out in.
Well, ultimately, there's a scene that there's an aerial view, and like birds are landing on it and stuff like that.
Yeah, they're walking on the hull and everything.
It's just really, it's cool and weird at the same time.
Yeah,
and I don't know. I'm okay with it, but I wasn't sad to see it go because that wasn't my favorite version. It's grown on me here and there from different angles when you see a new version come out and say, hey, it's pretty cool looking from that angle. But ultimately, the next ship we got was fantastic, and that was the Enterprise E.
Well, from First Contact, which was an excellent film.
Yeah, and so instead of revealing us the new ship at the end of Generations, as they did earlier at the end of The Voyage Home, we start First Contact with a brand new Enterprise, and it was just unbelievably cool looking and beautiful. It had a few changes as the movies went on. From First Contact to Insurrection to Nemesis, there were very few changes. There was slight nacelle changes. There was like the captain's yacht added to it.
It's a totally slick looking ship. It was just, it was like a yacht.
It's like it was built for speed, built for battle, and the angles of and the style of special effects had grown. So they showed this ship doing all kinds of badass things on the screen, and it really made it cool.
And it lasted through, like you said, First Contact, and it went all the way through to Nemesis, where it kind of, didn't they crash it on Nemesis against the Romulans or something?
Yeah, at the end of Nemesis, they just basically ram the Shinzon ship.
Yeah.
And again, like I said, that wasn't quite a complete destruction because at the end of that movie, they show it again in a space dock getting upgraded or whatever. We never quite saw what happened. I think there was some comics or some novels suggesting it moved on and there was, ultimately gave way to another version of the Enterprise, which, again, may or may not mean anything to you and I, but there was a video game that had an Enterprise F in it. I don't know if it had any of the crew members that we know, don't really know the timeline or anything about it.
And it was also an insurrection, right?
Oh, yeah. The ship we know as the E was in First Contact, Insurrection, and
Nemesis,
Nemesis, yeah. And then, they made reference to it, I think, in other versions of Star Trek TV shows that you probably watch more than me. I'm not quite sure if they ever mentioned the E in Deep Space Nine's final seasons or if they mentioned it in
I don't remember.
Voyager.
Why don't you talk a little bit about the other letters that are somewhat canon in an alternate type of manner? The J.
Well, the J appears in an Enterprise. Yeah, the F was part of that video game, like I said, that may or may not mean anything to you and I. The people who love the video game probably say, no, that's it. That's a cool ship. And that became...
but the J is more realistic.
The J actually appeared on screen very, very loosely and briefly in an episode of Enterprise that basically there's a time traveler from the future coming back to talk to, I guess, Archer about what's happening, what's going on in the future, what he has to do to make sure that happens, etc., etc. Now, of course, we don't know any capabilities. We only know that picture. People have they've extrapolated that picture and made 3D renderings of it and made models and made online pictures.
It's the basic shape of the Enterprise, except it's much skinnier, much thin.
Sleeker, modern. It looks like it has a big saucer, big thin saucer.
And the dish is huge.
The dish array is actually part of the bridge, and then there's nacelles in the back. So it keeps the Star Trek vibe going, but a much, much futuristic, modern, almost like it's a bug-like look to it, but not quite. And it's pretty awesome. Again, I wish there was a way, it's come to a lot of our attention lately that fan films have been out there, and some of them are pretty fantastic what they've done, and there's some pretty famous actors that have participated. But I wish people were allowed to do more. CBS is kind of cracking down. They may or may not be allowed to do it in the same manner in the future, but we could see more of this stuff. They could set some guidelines where they want to keep people from going, and then allow these fan films who can now make special effects as good as most of the shows and movies we've seen up until now. But unfortunately, it's not something that's likely to happen soon.
Well, that's apparently what they just recently done. But Paramount has set guidelines after allowing this last. They're apparently very strict, and people are not happy about it. But hey, let's jump over to the current movies because we have now almost 3 movies that have come out almost.
Yes.
Which are, again, I know it's a reboot of the franchise, but they worked it out in the story so that it's kind of like an alternate timeline. If you think about the way things are happening, they worked it as an alternate timeline, thereby redesigning once again the Enterprise, which we've gotten on the 2009 Star Trek and Into Darkness. We got to see this new ship, very modern looking, even though it takes place while these guys are young. you
it's
know,
more modern,
it's more modern than the classic Kirk Enterprise.
And I'm fine with the 2009 movie, and I'm pretty okay with this style of ship. Although I have mentioned many times my beef with Into Darkness, but also they're a little vague. They weren't very clear, and I'm not even sure if we've got a final answer on how big this ship is. And ultimately, we see it being built on Earth. Kirk's on his motorcycle.
Yeah, on dry dock.
Well, yeah, rather than being built in space, it's being built and almost completed on Earth in Iowa. Okay, that's fine. And then we're alleged to believe, based on just some technical information put out with the movies, that ship is humongous. This ship is bigger than the D and the E. And I'm not sure if they meant it to be that way. I don't know if people made a mistake and the sizes, they use feet into meters or something like that. I'm not sure. But I don't think it's meant to be as humongous as it is, but let's say it is. It's got some pretty classic lines to it, and it's a combination of maybe the motion picture Enterprise and some other fan-made looks over the years. So it's the engineering section is a little weird. The nacelles are a little too big, but on screen it does the job. Especially, like I said, in the 2009 version. In Into Darkness, they're kind of almost crashing it again, and to the point not where it's destroyed, but it needs a refit. Let's say so. By Beyond, I've seen the trailer, and so have you. What do you think happens to the Enterprise in that movie, Carlos?
If it doesn't get completely destroyed, it gets completely broken in some shape or form.
I have a feeling it's the completely destroyed version, and we're going to see a new Enterprise if the series continues past Star Trek Beyond, which is fine. It's probably due. It's okay because, if you follow history, there were many versions. There were many A's and B's and C's as we've seen. So this would make sense for the movie version to happen, the JJ version to have the same, maybe not exact history, but similar, with refits or new ships after a destruction or something like that. I don't know. I'm okay with it. I love the Enterprise. I love seeing new ships. I just hope they don't get too crazy, when they start. It's like killing a character. Same thing with, look, we're going to kill Spock. He doesn't, Nemo might not want to be in a movie, so we'll kill Spock. Just let's not kill the Enterprise just because it looks cool in the movie and creates drama. I hope there's a good reason in this movie for the ship to be destroyed.
Right. The other thing we have to also keep in mind is that CBS is bringing Star Trek to television again, and yes. I'm not entirely sure how they're going to deal with the existing mythology of Star Trek and specifically the Enterprise itself. Will this be an Enterprise?
Yeah, I'm not even sure where this new show will fit. It's been a little vague exactly where, and it's probably not going to be Enterprise-centric. It'll probably be, Starfleet and Federation-centric, but it might not, this ship that might not be an Enterprise. It might be a similar design. It might be a similar era, but I don't think we're going to actually see the Enterprise, which is probably good. It allows for some new stories to be told in that whatever. I mean, it'd be great if they told it in the world after the Enterprise, after the Next Generation crew, so we can see some of that. But it wouldn't be terrible if it was earlier, too, because then somehow we could say, well, we're not going to see Kirk and those guys, but Kirk's off doing something there, and you'd at least say, oh, it makes sense. It's just another ship in the fleet.
Yeah, but the question, what I'm wondering about, again, the details are the details, but can they stay away from being as very specific as to where are we in the timeline of the history?
I think based on what I've read, it's not in the JJ version. It's
okay.
Maybe in let's call it the Prime. I know I've read some things where, Star Trek, the Prime universe versus the JJ universe or reboot universe. I'd prefer it in the Prime universe because, that's where I was raised. That's what I watched. That's what I love. And characters could appear that I care about potentially if it's in any of the eras that overlap. In the JJ universe, you say, okay, well, let's keep that in the movies maybe. That's something they needed to do to bring it into, the new kids generation and stuff like that, more excitement and, give back a little to the older fans. We've been around a long time. I don't know, maybe that sounds oldish, but I would like it to be in the Prime universe somehow and go further, as we've said, to an Enterprise G or H or K or whatever it needs to be, not even with a letter attached to it, just so it's still in the stuff we grew up with.
Yeah, I doubt very much that they would want to step over their own franchise and diminish, the future possibility of movies, by contradicting itself or creating some kind of conflict between a television show and a movie. So I have a feeling they're going to try to somehow be able to run both of these things at the same time without interfering with each other, or maybe even collaborating with each other. Who knows?
And writers and people who were involved with the best of Star Trek are participating in this new future one. So I don't think we'll be let down. And it might be weird at first, just like The Next Generation was weird to a lot of people who are Kirk and Spock fans, to the point where they said, well, I don't know if I'll ever watch that, until eventually, of course you watched it. Everybody watched it. It was Star Trek, There were very few holdouts after the first or second year saying, I'm never going to get into that one, or that's not for me, my guys are Kirk and Spock. There were actually people who did that back then. And so I think we're going to like what we see. They say it's going to be a little harder edged. It's like a lot of shows on HBO and FX and AMC are a little harder core, a little more violence, more sex, more language. I think they're going to try to do this. Star Trek still comes from a premise that is supposed to be optimistic and looking forward, and the troubles we face now are nonsense and they're behind us. So I hope they don't just forget all that, because I think a lot of the more recent Star Treks have forgotten what Roddenberry created, and they became petty. The episodes became petty and too much based on what we're dealing with now in the world, rather than versions of what we're, they didn't say, oh, we're still dealing with the Vietnam War. There was versions of that type of thing, or versions of racism that they were dealing with, rather than putting it right in your face and saying, oh, he's a black guy or he's a Spanish guy. No, it was a guy who had half white and half black, but the other guy was half black and half white. You have to figure out the nuance, you know what I mean? So I'm hoping this show still kind of becomes Star Trek with a positive view of the future, that we can get past all the nonsense and not just, hey, let's have sex and fight.
Well, I'm looking forward to the new show and hopefully be able to see new ships and maybe even a little Enterprise cameo here or there in some shape or form. The only thing I'm not happy about is the fact that this is going to be a stream subscription only.
Yeah, well, we'll see.
CBS Online type of deal, which is like,
okay,
what?
Let me just say, we'll see about that. Okay, they're saying that now because they want to get attention for whatever this streaming online nonsense is.
Well, they want to do their own Netflix, basically.
Yeah, but when it becomes huge, it's going to be available to as many people who want to see it. It won't be just for people who are subscribing type of stuff.
I hope so.
This is Star Trek now. This isn't just some like little Johnny come lately. They're going to want to sell. Yeah, it's limited. It's limited to as many people that they can get to watch it. That's how limited it's going to be.
Yeah. Well, this brings us to the end of today's show. I hope you enjoyed it. Just a couple of quick plugs here. Please take the time to take a look at MetroCon. MetroCon is coming to Tampa, Florida, and we'll be there to enjoy the show. Check out this anime and cosplay extravaganza from July 21st to the 24th. We're going to be there. Get a peek at its intriguing programming at www.metroconventions.com and look for a GeekFest Rants episode on the world of cosplay in the near future. And also, put down on your calendar, August 17th to the 21st, we are promoting the Mid-Americon 2, this is the 74th WorldCon convention, which is happening in Kansas City Convention Center, Kansas City, Missouri. The reason we're promoting this particular event is because one of our show friends, Charles Lippincott, is going to be there. He is the mastermind behind the merchandising and licensing of the original Star Wars film, as we mentioned on a previous show that we've done. He is going to be there recreating his convention promotional tour that he used to do back in 1976, 77, right before the movie came out, where he would display props from the film and have a slideshow talking about it, this is how they used to do things back then. But anyway, he's going to be doing that for the first time. If you happen to be in the area, this would be an absolutely perfect way of meeting Charles and getting to see that presentation that he did so many years ago, which again, it's not done like that anymore. If you're a real deep Star Wars fan, into the nitty gritty making of aspects of the film, this is perfect. And I believe this will also be available on video at a later time. Well, listen, I want to thank James, as usual, for joining me today, helping us go through more of our 50th anniversary of Star Trek themed shows that we've been doing. and you guys for listening, and we will see you here soon at GeekFest Rants. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Military log, supplemental. Lieutenant Tasha Yar has transferred to the Enterprise C, where she has taken over tactical duties. Meanwhile, our long-range scanners have picked up Klingon battle cruisers on an intercept course.
Number and type of ships, Mr. Crusher?
3 Cavort-class battlecruisers, sir.
They're not even troubling to cloak themselves.
They shouldn't be so confident after the pasting we gave them on Archer 4.
Attention all hands. As you know, we could outrun the Klingon vessels, but we must protect the Enterprise C until she enters the temporal rift. And we must succeed. Let's make sure that history never forgets the name Enterprise.
Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its continuing mission:
to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations,
To boldly go where no man has gone before.
My God, this is a bunch of nerds theorizing about fiction material.
Dun 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 dun.